Worcester, Massachusetts, the shire town or county seat of Worcester County. The date is September 6, 1774. This is 7 months before the American Revolution supposedly began at Lexington and Concord. Now at dawn, the militiamen start marching into town. They come from Uxbridge down by the Rhode Island border and from Winchendon up by New Hampshire, from 37 distinct towns. This is literally, by an actual head count, 4,622 militiamen, half the adult male population of the entire sprawling rural county. Now these men are angry. To punish Boston for the Boston Tea Party, the British Parliament has just yanked away the charter for all of Massachusetts. For 150 years, people have been gathering in their town meetings to govern themselves on most matters, but now they can't even call a town meeting anymore. They've been exercising some say over the choice of their officials, all the way from the governor's council down to the local sheriffs. But now all these are going to be appointed either directly by the king or by the king's appointed governor. So these people are disenfranchised, and they're rising up as a body to say no way. They are going to close the court, the outpost of British authority in Worcester County. So when 24 court officials show up to work in their dress suits and wigs, and they go up to the courthouse, it's all barricaded, filled with militiamen inside. The town is teeming with militiamen bent on seizing their authority. With nowhere else to go, they retreat to Daniel Haywood's Tavern halfway down Main Street and huddle inside, while the militiamen outside decide the formalities of their surrender. So here's what the militiamen decide to do. First of all, they line up on Main Street from Haywood's Tavern up to the courthouse, about 2,300 on each side. And then they usher forth from the tavern one of the officials, and he stands between the lines, and he takes his hat in his hand, and he recites the recantation that he and the other officials have been forced to sign. He says, we cede to the authority of the people. We will never execute the unconstitutional act of the British Parliament that reduces people to arbitrary power. Well, that's a strong recantation, but the problem is only these people heard it. It stretches for a quarter mile, so he has to step forward and say it to the next group, and then to the next group, and over and over and over, 30 times each, over 30 times each. He walks the gauntlet, reciting his recantation, and all the other officials have to do the same thing. And with this dramatic and humiliating display of submission, the courts are closed, and all British authority disappears from Worcester County, never to return. Now, Worcester was not alone. Here's a map from the Massachusetts Historical Society for a few years later. Now, you see all the towns. You're not going to be able to read the names, but look at how many of them. They're everywhere. This is a populated area. Even though it's countryside, it's populated. As a matter of fact, 95% of the population of Massachusetts at this time lives outside of Boston. And everywhere, in all these towns and farming communities, when the court is going to meet, the people swarm on the county seat, the shire town, and they close the court. Everywhere but Boston. Boston, with only 5% of the people, that's the only shire town that doesn't close the court because the British troops are stationed there. But everywhere else, these people close the court and they shed British rule. Now here's the key. These people are not just protesting, they're not just dumping tea into the harbor. They are actually seizing control of governmental authority. This is the most successful and enduring popular uprising in our nation's history. Now, you'd think that our national narrative would feature it. I mean, the first transfer of authority from the British to the Americans, that's got to be a major event. I mean, any revolution, isn't it an important chapter in any revolution when actually, authority transfers from one side to the other? But it's not featured in our national narrative. It's not even mentioned. Go find it in your textbook. You're not going to find it. It's not there. So here's the big question. Why not? Why don't we tell this story? Who decides what stories we tell and what stories we don't tell? Who's the gatekeeper here anyway? Well, we Americans collectively, we are the gatekeepers. For the past 2 centuries, we've been trapping ourselves inside a narrow national narrative defined by just a handful of iconic themes and events. Taxation without representation, the Boston Tea Party, Boston Massacre, we can recite them by heart. But there was more to it than that. The original historians the people who wrote histories at the time, who were actually lived through those times, they told a larger story. They included this Massachusetts Revolution of 1774. But in the 19th century, other stories emerged that whisked it away. The shot heard round the world. You all hear that? Shot heard round the world, Lexington and Concord? Well, that phrase was coined by Ralph Waldo Emerson, the poet and essayist, 60 years later. And now, think of it, if that's the iconic beginning of the revolution, how could there possibly have been a revolution before the revolution? It just hides our story. How about Paul Revere's Ride? Listen, my children, you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Well, that poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, 86 years after the fact, on the eve of the Civil War. And look at the basic theme. A lone rider from Boston wakes the sleepy-eyed farmers. Sleepy-eyed farmers? 7 months earlier, you know, they had thrown off British rule, and in the interim, they had, you know, they had armed, they had trained, and they had formed a de facto government, and they were just preparing totally for a counter-revolution that they knew would follow. That counter-revolution did eventually come at Lexington and Concord, when the British were trying to retake territory that they had already lost. So why don't we tell this story? Why don't we tell the story of the, you know, why do we choose the Revere stories, the mythological ones, instead of the vital and authentic ones? Why do we do that? Well, for that we have to get a step deeper yet. We have to actually look at the narrative structures of the narratives, the structural forms of the narratives that we prefer, and what these have to say about revolution. Start with this. We like our stories to have heroes, you know, like the hero does this, and an individual protagonist, and the leaders, and the leaders do it all. But listen, you know, the leader has to drive the story, kind of like the movie we just saw. But where's the leader here? These people won't even accept a leader. They don't take a leader because they are totally democratic. They won't do it. But which is more powerful? A revolution with a leader telling people what to do, or a revolution where the people are rising up and commanding their own revolution? Okay, we like our stories with a clear plot line. You know, the revolution starts here and spreads to here, and then climaxes here. But where's the revolution? Where's the plot line in our story? It's just like erupting everywhere. But which is a stronger revolution? The one that has a nice, tidy line, or the one that erupts and it's just all over the place? We like our stories with some blood and guts. You know, if it bleeds, it leads. Well, this one didn't bleed. And why didn't it bleed? Because if you have 90% of the people on one side, as we did in this revolution, and only 10% on the other, you're not going to find a lot of resistance. But on the other hand, if you had more like a 60-40 split, well, then you'd have resistance. You'd probably have some bloodshed, and then you'd tell the big story of the revolution. But that's not a strong revolution. That's more like a civil war. The real revolution, the overpowering revolution, is where you have everybody joining in, the 90%. You know, and that's a stronger story. Finally, and here's a story we love to tell. It's a feel-good story. Tiny little David, the colonials, the outnumbered, outmanned, outgunned colonials, best mighty Goliath, the strongest British Empire on the earth. We love to tell that story. But now look at Worcester. How do you tell that story in Worcester? The 4,622 militiamen, these people are David, and those 20 court officials huddling in the tavern are Goliath. You see, it just doesn't fit. And if your story doesn't fit the narrative form, it doesn't get told, right? So let me leave you with this. Beyond the Massachusetts Revolution of 1774, beyond the distortions to the nature of revolution, beyond, and actually extending outwards to all our historical renderings, the way we tell history, beware of pat narrative forms and reruns of the same iconic stories, because these can hide more than they reveal.